Thanks all. I'm painfully aware I'm standing between yourselves, a coffee or a trip to the airport, so I'll try and make this worth your while. Okay, so I guess the origination for this talk was actually watching a talk from my learned colleague Nigel Fair last year around communicating with the board, and it really sort of drove me to think about, what was the incentive around why you would communicate with the board. And I think actually in rewatching the talk this morning, in fact, I found myself in sort of violent agreement with a lot of what Nigel was saying, but there are aspects of it where I started to question the motives and the incentives behind why you would communicate with the board in the first place. So that was sort of where this talk came about. For those of you that know me, I would term myself as sort of a contrarian and a cynic. Other people would say a pain in the ass, but close enough. And for me, cybersecurity is a great industry in terms of there is a lot of accepted wisdoms and things that we just believe to be true because we have been told that that's just how it is. And as a cynic and a contrarian, I sort of think that is the perfect place to start asking questions and challenging that conventional wisdom around why that is the case. My colleague Nick Elsmore refers to them as sacred cows, and that slaughtering a sacred cow is not necessarily a bad thing. And when I think about that, one of the great examples that has really sort of come to light in recent times is passwords. So for years and years and years, and I've even sat in talks in AusCERT conferences talking about getting passwords to be 8 characters, letters, numbers, digits, upper character, all uppercase, lowercase, all of those sorts of things. And it's only recently where the trend has moved away from that actually having complexity of that nature in passwords and talking to users in that way is a bad thing and has created some really undesirable behaviors around passwords. But the thing that got me sort of about that was that the maths underlying the strength of a password being really related to the length of the password, not the complexity of the password, has been around for a very long time. And yet we continue to push forward and talk to people about complexity and about difficulty and didn't think about work effort and all these other concepts that inherently we knew in the back of our mind was actually far more important. So, in talking about the board, and yes, I'm aware that it's got a watermark on it, I just think kind of adds to the gravitas of the picture. When I talk about the success of cybersecurity, what are the things that allow you to measure whether or not a security function or a security program are successful? And there's really just sort of a few key things that I sort of believe. So the first one is that the security program needs to be functional and reliable. And you need to be able to depend on it to do stuff, and it needs to actually function in a reliable and reasonably predictable fashion. The next one is, security ultimately is about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And everyone here in this room knows that. So the role of the function is to identify and deliver that capability to the business. And so part of that is then around saying, well, how do we support that rather than driving that into the business? Largely, the role of cybersecurity is to ensure that the business can get that capability, confidentiality, integrity, and availability while doing the things that the business needs to do. And the common analogy that you'll often hear me raise is that a good security function is like brakes on a car. Brakes on a car aren't about stopping you, they are about allowing you to drive as fast as you are brave enough to drive and then stopping when you need to. In the same way, cybersecurity is about allowing the business to do the things it wants to do and take reasonable amount of risks without driving off a cliff and crashing and burning. So, as a cybersecurity professional, be it a CISO or an ISM or even a consultant like myself, that is ultimately the end game. That is what we want to achieve as a successful outcome. So, what's the role of the board in cybersecurity? Now, the UK and the US have some different nuanced definitions around the role of the board and what they're meant to do. But given that we're in Australia, I've gone with the AICD definition, which is that the role of the board governing, directing, and monitoring an organisation's business, affairs, and operations in 2 broad areas. The first one being overall organisational performance, and the second one being overall compliance and conformance. And already we're starting to see in the language that's being set out there that this is about the overall view. It's not about digging into the minutiae of various compliance aspects. It's overall, is the company compliant with the regulations and the legislation that it needs to be? From a director's perspective, that's the beginning and the ending of their responsibilities. So how does that apply to cyber? So, assuring the principal risks faced by the organisation are identified and overseeing appropriate control and monitoring systems are in place to manage the impact of risks. No mention of cyber, not even close. So we talk about risks instead, and we go, okay, well, cyber must be a bit like risk. And so you say, okay, well, let's just assume for a moment that cyber is a risk in the sense of the board. But risk is a really broad church, and the members of that church grow daily. But some of the other key types of risks that a board would consider would be financial risk, strategic risk, operational risk, reputational risk, potentially OH&S risk. So there is a great amount of different types of risks that a board would consider. The UK FRC, which is the UK Financial Reporting Committee, something like that, have emphasised that the board needs to consider cybersecurity risk, and in the same breath have said need to consider cybersecurity risk as well as climate change. And that starts to give you an idea of where we fit in the mix. Like, we're telling the board that we should consider cybersecurity in the same breath as climate change, and whether or not you believe in climate change or not, the ability of the board to influence climate change and evolve the strategic direction of their business in response to climate change, pretty difficult, even for really good directors. So I started looking and going, well, okay, well, what other things would a board want to consider? And then I landed on the definition here of principal risk. And for me, this is a really key carve-out. So principal risk, in governance terms, is risk that will directly impact the sustainability of your business model. Not of your business model. And so at this point, I think this is a really good sort of gut check for the cybersecurity industry. Like, if you sat down and went, honestly, is cybersecurity risk something that poses a principal risk to an organisation in their business model? Not in their business model. And my first reaction was, yeah, absolutely. Like, why would that not be the case? And then you start thinking about, well, ask Ashley Madison how that went for them. Their business model is really fine. Most of the major breaches that we have seen in the cybersecurity space have not resulted in a principal risk for the board. So why are we continuing to push cybersecurity risk to the board when it is not something that they are mandated to care about? And in fact, you may encounter undesirable behaviours from your board as a result. So this is a family photo from a recent holiday. I've never seen that redheaded kid before. I have no idea who that is. So the ACSI talks about the fact that the average board member holds about 2.3 roles. And of those 2.3 roles, they spend about 5 hours a week on that particular organisation. So all of a sudden, you've got this concept of these bickering children around, not only do you have to compete with your average board member for competition and attention and love and attention when it comes to the things that are going on relevant to your organisation, but also the other 1.3 other organisations that they're spending time on as well. And again, the role of a board member is not to provide detailed direction. It's strategic view, strategic risk avoidance. So when we start presenting really detailed guidance and information and concepts, all we're doing is muddying the waters. And in fact, there is an argument to be made, I believe, that it actually is placing the organisation at risk. The more shiny things we put up in front of board members, the better the chances they'll get distracted and move away from what their core focus should actually be. So part of what happens there is that we start falling into the trap of making bigger and grander claims around, here are the different things that we need to do, and the sky's falling in and Chicken Little and all those sorts of stuff. And that is a byproduct of the fact that we really believe that cybersecurity is a principal risk, and so we want to try and get that forward. But the evidence just doesn't support that. So in my opinion, that the cybersecurity industry has a really poor track record of self-importance. We continually tell ourselves that we are the guardians at the gate, and that if we don't do our job, organisations will crumble and they won't be able to survive in the wild west that is the internet. And cybersecurity people absolutely believe that cybersecurity is a principal risk. And again, the definition is it is an impact to the business model. But if cybersecurity is not a principal risk to your organisation, and for most organisations that is very quickly resolved by a chat with someone like the CEO, the Chief Operating Officer, potentially the CIO, to determine if that is the case. Cybersecurity is not a principal risk, then the board gets no better value from talking to cybersecurity than they do talking to the catering team or the cleaners. It just doesn't matter to them. It's not what they're focused on and shouldn't be something that we're trying to push up to them. So, cybersecurity, we do tend to live on the edge a bit. And if you think about the types of risks that get boiled up to the board, generally they end up as being, the very low likelihood type of risks with, the highest consequence. And from the board member's perspective, you end up in a scenario where risk analysis becomes next to meaningless. There is very little risk treatment or strategic guidance they can give about a risk that says the chances of this happening are like 1 in a million, but if it does, the entire business will just be, a smoking ruin. What can we ask them to do with that? The other problem with this is that we continually say that cybersecurity is a principal risk because we believe it to be true. But the evidence in the marketplace absolutely suggests that that is not true and has no prospect of being true any time in the near future. There's a couple of really good cases. So the first one being Equifax. So Equifax, in my opinion, is probably the worst breach that we'll experience in our generation because we have tens, 100-something million victims whose identity is now effectively worthless. They'll need to pay cash for everything forever. There is not a lot of change that they can do to get their identity back from the Equifax breach. So you go, okay, that was a really, really bad breach. The directors must have basically been hung, drawn and quartered because of the sheer impact of that breach. The CISO resigned, the CIO resigned. Now, arguably they jumped before they were pushed, but neither of them were punished with any real sense of liability for the incident. And the CIO actually got a pat on the back and an $8 million bonus on his way out the door as well to go and spend more time with his family. So arguably the largest and most severe breach that we have had in our history resulted in an $8 million bonus. These are not principal risks. This has not put Equifax out of business. I actually went to the point I was toying with the idea of saying, well, why don't I put the stock price up? And absolutely, you can see this dip in the stock price. But if you put it out across a big enough timeline, the recovery is very evident. Here in Australia, you look at census. So IBM took some degree of blame for the census debacle in 2016 and agreed to pay a $30 million settlement. So, that landed in the papers and everyone felt good about that. IBM is a $79 billion company. 30 million, to give you a sense of the scale of that is almost half of their bad debt provision for that year. And that's assuming you allow for a 1-to-1 exchange rate. So it doesn't even rate as a line item for them. It is a rounding error. Is that kind of breach and impact really a principal risk? It is not. Yes?
I mean, the data breach is one thing, but increasingly we're seeing attacks that are actually causing damage. So if you look at WannaCry and NotPetya,
yep.
And you look at the damage caused to, say, AP Moller Maersk, the global shipping company, it's
yep.
like $375 million. They were running on paper and phones for 2 weeks while their IT systems were being brought back up.
Yep, agree.
The only thing saved them was their business continuity plan, which worked.
Yes.
So wouldn't you call that a principal risk? Because they didn't have the right controls in place, their business could have been wiped out.
All right, let me answer it in this way. If it was a principal risk, and let's say any breach, find me evidence of a director who has been prosecuted as a result of negligence and a principal risk. Maersk still existed. Yes, they got smashed, as did Cadbury, as did Ansell, but ultimately they relied on the fact that they had good BCP processes and they were impacted but able to get back up and running. The fact that they were able to get back up and running, to me, indicates that it's not a principal risk. They had BCP, they had controls in place. It didn't destroy their business model, it just made life very, very difficult for a time.
But it could have if they hadn't had the right compensating things like the BCP that actually worked.
Yes and no. Yes, it did. So, fair. So they had BCP and all that sort of thing. But ultimately, their business model continues, and the fact that they've been able to survive and model their business beyond that, to me, suggests that actually it's not a principal risk. Is it an operational risk? Sure. And is it something they needed to treat and be aware of? Absolutely. But it's not a principal risk. Sorry?
I guess I just think I question how whether that's because boards just aren't accountable.
Well, so you're putting my notes up here. Well, so this is my other point. So the immediate response is then, well, we've got the National Data Breach legislation that's come out. Great. The Privacy Act and the Australian privacy principles have been out for nearly 20 years. We've had no punishment, nothing like that, because the alignment of the punishment and the public's expectation of what the role of the board is and what our industry's expectation of the board is compared to what the board sees as their role in managing principal risk are just not aligned. And whilst I might like them to be aligned, as I'm sure most people in the room would be, it's just not the case. So what do the cybers need for success? For those of you that aren't quite aware of the analogy, on a plate of bacon and eggs, the chicken's involved, but the pig is committed. Yep. So, if you're running a cybersecurity program, what do you need in order to be successful? The first one, money. Money buys you resources and it buys you time. So absolutely, that is something you need. You need executive commitment, not executive support, bacon and eggs. Yep. You need integration. If you're not integrated with the business, you'll have minimal ability to make an impact. You can't get the change you need in the places you need to make it. And probably one of the things that I like to draw out here is that ownership of security and of security risk is not the same thing as being a custodian of that security risk. Ownership is ultimately about if something really, really bad happens, who does the buck stop with? And 9 times out of 10, that will be the CIO or the CEO. The CISO, ISM, cybersecurity person is largely the custodian of that risk. They're the ones that are trying to mitigate it, provide advice and assurance on how that risk can be reduced, but they are not the ultimate owner of the risk. Of that list, none of those things are provided by the board. The board doesn't provide that funding, it cannot provide that commitment, and it certainly cannot provide the business integration. They are not the things you need to run a security program. Can the board provide some degree of high-level funding? Absolutely, but that's not directed in terms of going, you need to spend X amount of dollars to upgrade firewalls. It's not the same thing. So the psychology of influence. So let's talk about how you can influence some people and why. So it's often said that the best influencers come out of 2 camps, babies and psychopaths. Babies because they have complete clarity of what they want. While they are very, very bad at communicating it at times, as any parent can attest, they are very clear about what they want. Psychopaths have uncommonly high levels of empathy. They can actually read and understand human emotions and desires and all that sort of thing better than the average person. The difference is they don't give a shit. They are solely driven by what they want. They can read and abuse people's desires and requirements in order to get to their goal. So if you're a CISO, an ISM, who should you actually be trying to influence? And note here that I haven't said the CFO or the CEO or your boss. There's a part of that which is, it is just a given. If in your role you can't influence your boss or senior executives, then that is a challenge. What I'm talking about here is who are the non-standard people that you should also be out trying to talk to and get some influence in the business. So the first one is people that are popular in the organisation. People that have an influence on organisational culture. And the third one being people that your organisation, that controls who your organisation buys products and services from. They are your big 3. If you can influence them and get involved in their day-to-day working life, then your chances of having a successful cybersecurity function or program will be greatly increased. So why this one? And I just love this image, so I just keep using it. I'm just going to go with it. So the first one here, popularity. Everyone loves a winner, and there is no harm in hitching your wagon in order to get some inertia. See what I did there? That was clever. So you can do things like identify who are the teams in the organisation that are popular. Why are they popular? What are they doing? There will almost always be a team or a number of teams in an organisation that are seen as the cool teams. They're the ones that drive success and that innovation in the business. They're the ones you want to target. The quicker you can get to them, the better you'll be. The other one is culture. And particularly if you ascribe to the notion that culture is best defined as the things that people do when no one else is watching. The people that influence that culture often are the people who are, the successful, the winning, the popular teams. Not always, but there are also teams that for whatever reason just have an overwhelming influence on the culture in your organisation. And so they should be the people that you're trying to get in front of. One of the reasons is that people have a very good filter in terms of, if I'm delivering cybersecurity messages as a cybersecurity person, of course I have a self-interest. But if someone else from a different team is also delivering cybersecurity messages, then all of a sudden that self-interest isn't nearly as clear, and people are far more likely to accept the influential nature of that information. And the last one, purchasing. Purchasing and vendor risk management, I know there was a talk here a little earlier today around vendor risk management, I think is incredibly important and is growing to be even more so. At the rate organisations consume and acquire products and services, as a security manager, if you can't control or get some visibility of the rate of stuff that's entering your organisation, over time you end up chasing your tail trying to secure things after the fact. If you can establish a good working relationship with that team, then you have a better opportunity to filter stuff before it lands. So, how do we influence people? What are some techniques that we can use to influence? So the first one is that FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt doesn't work. And we've known that for quite some time. But because of the nature of our industry and our roots as a hacker mentality or a defense mentality, we do fall back on that bad stuff will happen if you don't do X. So it is a very easy fallback position, but it's something that we should be very wary of over time. Some of the other techniques to be aware of is things about don't make it about you, framing, and also the bandwagon. And we'll talk about these. So one of the first ones is fear as a motivator. And there's been a number of studies, and the most recent one I could find was from 2014, which was indicating that fear is not a good motivator over time. It's an excellent motivator if you need a catalyst for change, you need a one-off change, but on an ongoing basis, if you continue to tell people bad stuff will happen and it doesn't happen, it becomes less and less effective. It is in essence a one-shot pistol. You get one go at it, and if you don't get it right, you have to move on. So these are the Dr. Cialdini, his 6 principles of influence, and then he came up with a 7th because he needed to write another book. And these techniques are really common in management theory. And for those of you that are into social engineering, you'll see some similarities here with different techniques in social engineering. So reciprocation, the idea of, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, pretty common. In social engineering terms, we call it the little favor. So you ask someone to do a little favor and then you immediately follow up with a bigger favor. They are less likely to deny the second favor. Consistency, so repeating the message and having a consistent message throughout who you're talking to, or repeating the message over and over again, lends credence to the fact that the message is true and it is something that they should pay attention to. Social validation, knowing that actually this will make me more popular or more liked elsewhere. Facebook likes or LinkedIn likes is the most common example of this, is that stuff is good because other people like it. Likes, and I kind of find this likes one funny, because ultimately what it is about is being nice. People want to feel nice, they want to feel good. Delivering stuff with a smile makes a difference. And in any social engineering engagement, people who spend their time doing this will tell you that turning up and asking nicely with good manners and a smile will get you surprisingly far when you need it to. So if you're asking favours and you're trying to influence an individual, be nice about it. Ask nicely. Use some give and take. Find some ways you can find some mutual ground. But if you are demanding and saying this is how it's got to be, people will put up a barrier and your chances of success are much more reduced. Some of the others are authority. So this must happen because someone from on high has declared that this is a thing. Scarcity, if you don't do it, we will run out of time, or something like that. And the last one, the seventh one, is unity, which is really about we should do this because we're all in it together. And it's the sense of cohesion, community, and general goodwill. And unity is actually a really powerful technique if you combine it with some of the others. So if you talk about reciprocation and unity being, if you do this, then overall the team's going to benefit, and you'll get looked after as well, and we'll all sort of get carried along. It's the framing of that messaging using those tools that's really important. Be aware though that this is not a checklist. It's a toolkit. So make sure you're using the right tool at the right time. Don't try and use a screwdriver to screw in a nail or something like that. Make sure that you use the right technique and you have the self-awareness to know what needs to be applied when. The power of self-interest. So one of the big things is humans being driven by self-interest. And generally this is around the what's in it for me. And a lot of organisations will have political animals, people that are trying to build an empire or a fiefdom or something like that. And for them, appealing to that self-interest is absolutely critical, because ultimately that is all they care about. And some of the things you can do to work around this is what is known as sort of the law of reactance. So, you can't tell someone what to do. Or as most of us know, it's mum or dad's guilt trip. Do what you think is best. Do what you think is best for the organisation. The amount of times that will lead to a positive outcome for you, you've led them to the decision, you've explained all the benefits. I trust you to do the right thing for your team and for the organisation, and leave it there. The ability for people to have a decision made on their behalf is very, very difficult. The ability for people to make their mind up, if you can get them 99% of the way there and then trust them to make the right call with a smile, very effective. The other one is also self-definition or self-determination, which is usually framed as, if we wanted to get started tomorrow, what do you think we should do? Where would we start? Answer the question, great, thank you, yep, we'll get going, and thank you for your assistance. All of those little techniques around trying to get you over the line in terms of convincing them that this is something that they should do. The bandwagon, as I said, don't be adverse to jumping on the bandwagon, or several of them if you need to. Embedding security concepts into successful programs and successful teams has a higher degree of success than trying to go it alone. One of the other nice things about the bandwagon effect is nudging. Identifying the fact that people also need to get on the bandwagon. This is your opportunity. It's going really well. We're getting some really great uptake in this program. You should get involved. Those sorts of techniques will bring people along. It'll give them an opportunity. It shows them what's in for them, and it'll give you a better opportunity for success. So we contrast that and go, okay, well, how have these techniques ever worked in the past? Are you making this up? So one of my favourite stats is to look at what happened around OH&S culture over the last 10 to 15 years. So if you think about 10 to 15 years ago, the nature of workplace safety, people were fairly relaxed about workplace safety. And then we had really high incidence of workplace deaths and injuries. And so workplace safety became a bigger and bigger thing. And now it is absolutely baked into our cultural and organisational DNA that OH&S is something you should care about. Even here, we're looking at cables taped down and things like that. Like, it is something now that we just innately believe to be right. And some of that is purely because the effectiveness of the way OH&S was driven into organisations. And if you have a look here, this is some of the imagery that comes out. This is not do this thing, and it is not negative. It is all positive, reassuring messages. It's all about, here is what's in it for you. Getting home safe is what's in it for you. This is the right thing to do. It's heavy use of social validation and likes. And the reason why is it works. Our friends back at Safe Work Australia, they reduced through these programs, workplace deaths over 10 years, 44% drop. That is a meaningful change. And if you want to talk about principal risk for an organisation, having a major workplace incident that resulted in death or significant injuries to staff members. You want to talk about principal risk, that would absolutely fit the category. That has the potential to put a business out of business. So be careful what you wish for. So what happens? Let's just say that you do end up with conversations with the board on a regular basis. And again, going back to Nigel's presentation last year around the communications and how you should communicate to the board, there's a lot of great stuff in there around how you should communicate to the board in the event that you get that opportunity. But if you consider the average makeup of the board, so according to the ASX, the average board member is a white male, aged 63. So for most of them, IT, cybersecurity, all these things are very new concepts. This is not stuff that they are innately familiar with. It is already challenging enough. These people are very good at assessing principal risk, organisational risk, strategic risk. They are very bad and very immature at measuring cybersecurity risk. And again, you end up with this concept that most of the risks that land at the board level are lowest likelihood, highest impact, and so they just become a risk fodder for a risk register. And it doesn't actually change your ability to influence positive outcomes within the organisation. One of the other challenges that we also see is that we're forced to provide dumbed down input. And usually that dumbed down input is heavily influenced by the people that are the conduit to the board. And so because the board members don't understand cybersecurity concepts, we're forced to provide it in a way that really doesn't convey the seriousness of what we're talking about. And ultimately, that puts the organisation at risk and it undervalues your role in the organisation. One of the other challenges we see is, what I like to call the AFR effect. But a board member read something in the AFR, 5 minutes before they walked in, and now they're an expert on that. Next week, good news, you're deploying blockchain because they read about it. That happens all the time. And again, it is because attempts to influence the board in a particular direction, all that does is open them up to influence from other channels, and all of a sudden that now you're putting out spot fires everywhere because you're not providing a consistency of purpose and a consistency of message. So what should you do? What is the way to get around this? For me, trying to influence the board is a waste of time. And the two reasons for that are they can't give you what you need, and your role is not principal risk. And so there is a fundamental misalignment in priorities there. Second, you want to provide accessible, meaningful metrics on demand. It needs to be something that the board have access to whenever they need it, and it talks to them in a way that is meaningful around principal risk and topics like that. When was the last time, if you want to contrast that, like when was the last time a board member asked about trip hazards? But if you had board members asking about what are our vulnerabilities like at the moment, that's a sign that there is a fundamental break in the way you're communicating upwards, because those kind of topics are not the things that board members could or should comprehend and involve in their decision making. For me, the best result is if you're not getting questions from the board and you're seen as a safe pair of hands, that's fantastic. That is a great outcome. Don't perceive lack of communications or lack of questions as lack of interest. Often it just means we trust that you're doing a good job. This is now BAU. This is a good thing. And lastly but not least, you don't need to influence from on top. You can influence from below. The best thing you can do is run a really effective cybersecurity program or function, and that will get you much further in terms of supporting the business outcomes than any amount of influencing could. And that's me. Any questions? Yep, fire away.
Any difference between private sector and public sector boards with any of this?
In my experience, no. I think probably private sector boards are more aware that there is an opportunity to go out of business. Like if you're a public sector board, going out of business is not a sort of a fundamental concept that they worry about. So framing risk to them is a little bit different. But I think as an overall concept, it's largely the same thing. It's just how you structure the communications should you be asked to. Yeah,
Another
go again.
question. You've mentioned a lot about risk. What about the compliance part?
Yeah, so, and that's a good question. So if you go back original, like one of the responsibilities of the board is compliance or conformance. And I think that's right. But from the board's position, it is, are we compliant with the regulatory statutes that we need to be? And the list is a mile long for a typical organisation. Now, yes, things like NDB and GDPR at the moment will absolutely land up on the board's radar, as well it should. But if all of a sudden your response is we're going to now run a cyber program because the board is aware of GDPR, you are so far behind the 8 ball. So that should be something where you go, yep, we've got it covered, it's under control. And that's the difference between having a well-run function and a function that's run by the AFR effect. All right? Thanks very much, everyone. Appreciate your time.